Recording in progress.
Hi, can you hear and see me?
Yep.
Perfect. Perfect. First, any questions or concerns? Okay.
I'm using a new computer today
Yeah,
and I really don't know how to work it. So excuse me if I log off or something, you see me disappear, but I'll
oh,
try
I
to.
don't, Casey, just come back. It doesn't matter to me. It really
Okay.
doesn't.
Okay.
I mean, you'd be amazed how many times I'm students are get not kicked out of the class unintentionally and come right back.
Okay.
Don't worry about it.
Okay.
I don't know how many times it happens all the time. Let's see here. So we're gonna finish chapter 12. We were almost done before. We're gonna finish it. And we are going to move on to, excuse me, we're gonna move on to chapter 13, which we may finish also. You'll realize it's not very long. And then we'll continue into chapter 14. So I think we're about right here. So talked about synapses before. We talked about neurotransmitters. We talked about how they can be excitatory and inhibitory. Presynaptic facilitation is when one neuron, let me back up just a second. When presynaptic interactions can be facilitating or they can be inhibiting. So one presynaptic neuron can have the effect on another presynaptic neuron. If it's facilitating, that means it's going to be enhancing. And so it's going to enhance and act and be more, have a positive influence on the first neuron. If it's inhibiting, it's going to have a negative impact. And it's going to inhibit the effect of the next neuron. So with that in mind, one presynaptic neuron enhances the effects of another presynaptic neuron. So neuron F releases a transmitter through a synapse onto neuron S. And the transmitter that neuron F releases is going to allow for calcium channels. Remember where calcium is, where's calcium necessary in, where's calcium necessary in release of neurotransmitter? Do you remember?
Is it vital for nerve conduction?
It is, but where is it vital for nerve conduction? Where do we need it most?
Bones,
Say it again.
like in your bones.
Well, where do you need it in your neurons? You do need it in your bones, but where is it necessary in the conduction of a signal from one neuron to another?
The neuron transmitter?
Yeah, where is it needed there? Let me see if I can scroll back and figure out which slide it's specifically on. Let's see here. Look on slide 111. I'm coming back to where we were before, but look on slide 111. It's involved in the exocytosis of the neurotransmitter from the axon terminal. So you have to open calcium channels in order for neurotransmitter to be released from the terminal. From what I understand, calcium actually binds to those vesicles. So what that means is that if neuron F releases a neurotransmitter that allows for calcium channels to stay open longer, it means that neurotransmitter will be released for a longer period. If it's released for a longer period, it's released into the synaptic cleft for a longer period. And in the synaptic cleft, if it's released in the synaptic cleft for a longer period, it's available to bind to the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron for a longer period. What that means is that the postsynaptic neuron R here, is going to be activated for a longer period. That's facilitation, is when one neuron is enhancing the effects of another neuron to allow for the postsynaptic neuron to be activated for a longer period. Presynaptic inhibition is the opposite, where one presynaptic neuron is going to inhibit the effects of another presynaptic neuron. So it's going to be used to reduce or halt unwanted transmission. So one neuron releases an inhibitory neuron on another presynaptic neuron. And instead of allowing calcium channels to stay open for a longer period, GABA, in the case of an inhibitory transmitter, is going to prevent those channels from opening. So the result is that the neuron that had an application of GABA, this neuron S, is going to have is not going to release any or very little neurotransmitter onto neuron R, which means that even though an action potential comes down to the axon terminal, because neuron I is now releasing an inhibitory neurotransmitter on neuron S, neuron R, the postsynaptic neuron, is not going to get activated. So neuron I is going to inhibit presynaptic stimulation of neuron R. Is this clear? So it's essentially one presynaptic neuron inhibiting or enhancing the effects of the second one. By either by applying an excitatory neurotransmitter or an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Last part of this chapter talks about neural coding. This is the mode by which information about and around the body is communicated in a meaningful action pattern of action potentials. Think of this as a Morse code for action potentials. So many beeps means one letter, so many beeps means another letter. That's the way these are occurring. So this is a labeled line code. This is the basis of this is that each nerve fiber is activated by a receptor that recognizes only one form of stimulus. The optic nerve, for example, the receptors only only know how to recognize a light stimulus, something that involves in photo light waves. This is probably the coolest example I know of in the nervous system. Your optic nerve only senses light. And so what happens, and we've all done this, what happens when you do this? You close your eyes and you rub your eyes. I woke up a little late this morning, so this is not one of my mornings where I'm obviously not completely awake. So rub my eyes. What do you see when you rub your eyes? When you cover your eyes and you rub your eyes? What?
Stars.
You
Yeah,
see
stars.
stars. Why do you see stars?
I don't know, because you're cutting off the light.
Well, you still see a light, are you? Do me a favor, do it now.
are you still seeing like tiny pieces of light coming through like your eyelids? Like, I mean, very dim, but
Well, you see little speckles of light, right, Kat?
yeah.
What it is you're putting pressure on receptors that only know how to detect light.
Okay.
And so those receptors are trying to essentially make sense and transmit a message that only those receptors can only receive light. So you're activating those receptors, but you're doing it in a form that they don't really know how to comprehend.
That's pretty cool.
It is kind. It is, isn't it? I read that in your textbook last year. I thought that's awesome. But yeah, so what you're doing is it's a stimulus that's being received, but it has to be interpreted as a form of light. So how does that receptor get stimulated there and interpreted as a form of light? So all receptors only recognize one specific type of stimulus. So you fire action potentials that are only one particular type of stimulus. So when that message is received by the brain takes that code of a certain rate or intensity of stimuli. The stimulus strength is interpreted by how many neurons are firing. Different neurons have different thresholds of excitation. Some neurons are excited at a lower threshold. Some are excited at a stronger threshold, at a higher threshold. Additional neurons can be recruited if the stimulus continues to get stronger. So this is which neurons are firing. Certain ones are going to fire at lower levels of stimulus. Others require a higher level of stimulus to fire. How many are firing? That's how the stimulus strength is recognized. The stimulus intensity is what's the rate of firing. A weak stimulus can cause a neuron to generate 6 action potentials per second, while a strong stimulus can generate over 600 per second. So a weak stimulus can generate 6 per second. A strong stimulus can generate over 600 per second. So intensity is the rate of firing. Strength is how many neurons are firing. Last part, talking about neural pools. So we know that neurons coordinate. There's a lot of neuron coordination that's got to occur. If we have over, how many did we thought we had? Over 50 billion neurons. There has to be a lot of coordination between those neurons. So neurons function in larger assemblies called neural pools, where each pool can consist of thousands of interneurons concerned with a particular body function. So they function with it with regards to neural circuits where there's a complicated network of neurons that process specific types of information. If you look here, we have one neuron, and there's 5 presynaptic neurons here that are synapsing on this one postsynaptic neuron. One of them is giving an excitatory postsynaptic potential. One's an inhibitory, one's an excitatory, one's an inhibitory, one's an excitatory. The net summation of these different postsynaptic potentials will determine whether or not an action potential is generated. So 4 basic types of circuits. We have a diverging circuit, which is where one nerve fiber branches and synapses with several postsynaptic neurons, which then synapse with several more. This kind of circuit allows one motor neuron of the brain to ultimately stimulate thousands of muscle fibers. A converging circuit is one where many nerve fibers are going to be synapsed with one postsynaptic neuron. This allows input from your multiple areas, your eyes, your inner ears, your stretch receptors in your neck to be directed to one area of the brain that's concerned with balance. Sense of balance and equilibrium. A reverberating circuit is where the neuron is going to stimulate each other in a linear sequence. And some postsynaptic neurons are going to put out axon collaterals. Remember axon collaterals from the very beginning of this chapter. Are going to put out axon collaterals that can go back to earlier neurons in the pathway, synapse on them, and re-stimulate them. This allows for repetitious signals to your diaphragm and intercostal muscle to make you inhale. When the circuit stops firing, you exhale. Next time it fires, you inhale again. A single presynaptic cell can stimulate. This is a parallel after discharge circuit. So where one presynaptic cell stimulates a number of neurons and then synapses also with the common postsynaptic cell. So presynaptic neuron can synapse with other presynaptic neurons in addition to the postsynaptic neuron. So parallel after discharge, meaning it's going to, in addition to also synapsing with the postsynaptic neuron, it's going to stimulate other presynaptic neurons that are also going to synapse with that postsynaptic neuron. This allows for an after discharge effect. This is where you can stare at a lamp and then you close your eyes and continue to see an image of it for a while. You have questions for me about chapter 12? Let's move into chapter 13. You'll see that I think this one was 136 slides. Chapter 13 is only 71. So the spinal cord, the spinal nerves, and the somatic reflexes. Spinal cord injuries in the US. The spinal cord is the informational highway that connects the brain with the lower body. However, thousands of Americans are paralyzed by spinal cord injuries every year with devastating effects. Why is it so devastating when you sustain an injury to the spinal cord or the brain, either one?
Because those are parts of the central nervous system. So that's like what's controlling your movement and.
Yep, but why is it still so devastating? Why? I mean, you know, people get their lungs injured. They get their maybe get their they break a bone in their leg. Why is that? Why is a nervous system injury so devastating?
Because it can't rebuild itself.
Why can't it rebuild itself?
I know this.
I know you know it too.
Look through.
Why can't it rebuild itself? What makes the nervous system different from most cells? What makes a neuron most different from most cells?
Oh, what is it?
It's like not gonna make more, kind of that concept.
Why isn't it not going to make more? What's that process called?
I forget.
I can't remember what it's called either.
Mitosis? Sound about right?
Yes.
Okay. So these cells that the reason nervous system and neuron injuries are so devastating is partly like Kat said initially, it's they have to do with the fact that they're essentially the central part. They're going to coordinate all things. But those cells also don't regenerate. If you remember, we talked about regeneration, and the one thing that's missing with the central nervous system is they don't have Schwann cells and they don't have endoneurium. And therefore they don't regenerate. They don't divide and they don't regenerate. I only know of one spinal cord injury or not even spinal cord injury, traumatic brain injury that a friend's baby received right after he was born. And he ended up surviving that. But he sustained an accident in the nursery about when he was 12 hours old. They don't, honestly, nobody's ever come forth and said what happened. But he sustained a skull fracture. And he is now 12 years old. And he is a double hemorrhagic stroke survivor from an injury that occurred in the nursery 12 hours after he was born. And he lost, what they estimate is he lost over 75% of the 5 lobes of the brain. And they told his parents that if he survived that injury, he would most likely be a vegetable. And he's not. He's actually a pretty amazing person. He shows residual effects of being a stroke survivor. He shows a lot of signs of being autistic, even though he's not. He shows lots of signs of different parts of his brain not being able to communicate well with other parts. But at the same time, he's a walking, talking 12-year-old who eats and drinks and goes to school and walks and talks and does all sorts of things. And I honestly think that a lot of that is because there's very little myelination right after birth, which allows things to also be very flexible. That's my guess. But most spinal cord, most central nervous system injuries are non-recoverable. Functions of the spinal cord: conduction. Nerve fibers conduct sensory and motor information up and down in the spinal cord. So they conduct sensory, they conduct motor information. Moves up the spinal cord and it moves down the spinal cord. Neural integration: spinal neurons receive input from multiple sources, integrate, and execute appropriate output. So this is the intensity of the intensity and the strength of the stimulus, and excitatory and inhibitory postsynaptic potential summating. The spinal cord's involved in locomotion. The spinal cord contains central pattern generators, groups of neurons that coordinate repetitive sequences of contractions for walking. This is why once you learn to walk, most often you don't forget. You start to learn to ride a bike, you don't forget. Reflexes. Involuntary responses to stimuli that are vital to posture, coordination, and protection. If you've ever curled your hair, how many of you have ever grabbed the wrong end of the curling iron? It doesn't, how long does it take, Becky, for you to drop it?
Not long.
No, it's an involuntary response. You dropped it, and then you thought about the fact that it really hurt, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because you drop it before you recognize that you've actually been hurt.
Right.
That's a reflex. You guys, that's also, if you think about that, it's a major player in maintaining homeostasis. We talked about those feedback loops. You're going to see that here when we talk about reflexes. So the spinal cord is a cylinder of nervous tissue that arises from the brainstem at the foramen magnum of the skull. It ends at about L1. Of the lumbar vertebrae. This is because the lumbar vertebrae continue to grow and extend while the spinal cord stops. That's why the lumbar vertebrae, the vertebral column is much longer than the spinal cord. Approximately 100 million neurons are found in the spinal cord. And if you remember that for every one neuron, there's approximately 10 to 50 more neuroglia. It's about 50 times more neuroglia per one neuron. Extends from the medulla oblongata, which is in the brainstem. Talk about it in the next chapter. To the conus medullaris, which looks like a cone about right there. Right there. Spinal cord injuries commonly result in fractures of the C5 to C6 vertebrae, but never fractures from the L3 to L5 vertebrae. Why? So spinal cord injuries commonly result from fractures to C5 to C6, so up base of your neck. But we never have fractures of L3 to L5 vertebrae.
Is it more protected?
What protects it?
I want to say like your abdomen, your muscle, like more of your muscles and stuff.
What about your pelvis? Do you think your pelvis would protect it a little bit too?
Oh yeah. You probably would have more of a broken pelvis than a broken bone back there.
That's what my mother said too.
She must be really smart.
She is really smart. She's in her bedroom right now. But yes, because I just asked her because I kept thinking when I read this, and I didn't put this question, this is a PowerPoint that I received from someone else that I recreated and added to. let me say this differently.
Stop.
With this, I kept thinking that it had to do with the flexibility of the neck. There's a lot more vertebrae in the neck than there is in the lumbar area. There's a lot fewer bones in the neck and more in the lumbar area. I don't know if it's that reason is that it's more supported and protected down here, or if it's the fact that when things are more flexible, they're less stable. So your neck is much more stable than your lower back. So I mean, we're reading that question about the spinal cord injuries commonly result from fractures of C5 to C6, but never from L3 to L5. And I don't know which it is. I still want to think that part of it is the fact that there's a lot more flexibility in the neck, because where things are more flexible, they're less stable.
But you also have more protection down that low.
That's what Becky was saying here.
Great
She said,
minds.
where there's more protection, there's more stability. Yeah, I'm not sure.
The
But
other
I
thing
think-
I would think though, like if you do like the up, since it happens up top here, like the impact of your head and all that would be much harder, because if you fall on your, say your tailbone and stuff, it's more solid. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense too. I think it's a combination. So spinal surface anatomy and spinal nerves. The spinal cord occupies the upper 2/3 of the vertebral canal. Remember, it ends at about L1. It gives rise to 31 pairs of spinal nerves. I put away my little skeleton, or I should have left him out for this part of the chapter. But out of each of the vertebrae, there's an intervertebral foramen. Do you remember that when you talked about the vertebrae? Oh. Foramen. If you look here, here's the intervertebral foramen. Here's one vertebrae, here's another vertebrae. Here's the intervertebral foramen. And the spinal nerve is exiting that intervertebral foramen. It exits on both sides. Yeah, we only really see it from one. I don't see any pictures here. Oh, here's one. So it's exiting from both sides. So each of the intervertebral foramen, one spinal nerve is going to exit out from both sides. These look like they are lumbar vertebrae. And therefore, let's say that this is L2. So the L2 vertebrae is going to, on both sides of it, there's going to be an L2 nerve that's going to originate via the intervertebral foramen. And I didn't mean to take it right up to the very beginning, but we weren't very far. Okay,
Third time's a charm.
I know. So it gives rise to 31 pairs. Each part of the cord is supplied by one pair of spinal nerves, which is referred to as a segment. The very end, we'll talk about intersegmental reflexes. So that's important at that point. But each part of the cord is supplied by each part of the cord is supplied by one pair of spinal nerves. And so there would be like 31 parts. Or 31 segments. There's two enlargements. There's a cervical enlargement, which is going to give rise to the nerves of the upper limb. This will be the brachial plexus, is what it's also called. The lumbosacral enlargement is going to give rise to nerves of the pelvic region and lower limbs. The cauda equina, you guys, what does equine mean? Anyone here a horse person? My mom is a horse person.
Horse.
What it means? What?
I was like, it's like a horse.
It does. It means horse. So cauda meaning tail. So it looks like a horse's tail. So the cauda equina is going to originate off the conus medullaris at the very tip of the spinal cord. And it's going to give rise to a bundle of nerve roots that are going to occupy the vertebral canal from L2 to S5. This L2 to S5, this is referring to the different lumbar vertebrae and the different vertebrae. So we start with the C1 vertebrae, and the vertebral column ends with S5. The spinal nerves, remember there's 31 pairs, are divided into 4 regions. They're named according to the level of the vertebral column in which they arise. Off the cervical, in the cervical area, there's 8 cervical nerves that control the sensory, the motor activity of the head, neck, upper body, arms, and hands. How many cervical vertebrae are there?
Seven.
There's 7. How many? So there's 8 cervical nerves, and if they're all coming out intervertebral foramen, does that work? Braden, how do you get 8 cervical nerves if there's only 8 cervical vertebrae?
I guess one of them has 2.
Or another way is one is coming out the top. That's the way that we've got 8 cervical nerves. Is one is coming off the very top. So another, Braden, I guess you're partially right, because let's think of the fact that there's one coming off the top of the cervical, first cervical vertebrae, and there's one coming out the bottom. So there's two pairs coming off the first cervical vertebrae. The thoracic nerves, 12 pairs, controls the sensory and motor activity of the hands, the fingers, the chest, and the abdominal muscles. Lumbar nerves, there's 5 pairs. They control the sensory and motor activity of the hips, knees, ankles, and toes. Sacral nerves control the sensory and motor of the legs, toes, bladder, and anal muscles. And coccygeal nerves, 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. Questions? Since we know that nervous tissue, the loss of nervous tissue is pretty devastating. It's also fairly delicate tissue. So it requires protection. The first level of protection around the spinal cord are the vertebrae. So they provide a protective defense against damaging blows. The second level of defense are the meninges. You heard of meningitis? Meningitis is the inflammation of these meninges. So the meninges are these 3 protective, dense, irregular connective tissue membranes that enclose the brain and the spinal cord. These are sheets, these are layers of connective tissue, sheets of connective tissue that are continuous or that surround the brain and the spinal cord both. From superficial to deep, the mnemonic to remember is DAP. Dura mater is the most outer layer, and it is separated from the vertebrae by an epidural space. If you think epi always means on top, so this is a space on top of the dura mater, epidural space. The arachnoid mater, I am not a fan of scary movies. I only like scary movies when I know, do I even like scary movies? I like intense scary movies. I like movies, no, I don't like intense scary movies. I like movies that are suspenseful, but I don't like really ones that are paranormal scary things. Because then I can't make sense of that kind of stuff. And my imagination is pretty amazing, and that kind of stuff just scares me. One of the yuckiest and scariest movies I ever saw when I was a younger person is Arachnophobia.
That was just on the other day.
Was it? Was it because it was Halloween? It was, wasn't it?
I think so, yeah.
What is that about? What's arachnophobia?
It's about the scientists that were collecting unknown specimens from different countries, and this ridiculously huge spider somehow made its way back to America. And
Ugh.
it produces without a reproductive system.
Oh, really? Oh, see,
Yeah.
I haven't seen it in a long time because I can't sit through it.
But anyway, long story short, it's very deadly, and it went on a rampage, and
Killed a bunch of people.
yeah, my son wasn't impressed. I mean, he's 16
That's
and
one of my favorite movies.
I think I like it.
Me too.
It's terrifying.
My sister-in-law is definitely afraid of spiders, so she would never watch it.
It's terrifying. I didn't realize they're reproducing without a reproductive system. That's terrible. What does arachnophobia mean by definition?
Fear of spiders.
Okay, so arachnoid mater looks like a spider web. It's this webby, filmy matter, meninge. So it adheres to the dura mater through this spider webby film. And the subarachnoid space, so the space right underneath the arachnoid mater, is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. The pia mater is right underneath it. It's this delicate membrane composed of 1 or 2 layers of squamous to cuboidal cells with blood vessels that supply the nutrients. This, if we say 1 to 2 layers, how thick are most cells?
Not thick.
Generally, you can see through cells because they're that thin. So this is normally what you're looking at when you're looking at the surface of the spinal cord. You're looking through it. Now, I really wish I had pulled this picture. I'm going to try to bear with me just for a second here. Actually, I think I'm going to wait for it. I'm sorry, bear with me. I need to add a picture to this PowerPoint that I found the other day. Denticulate ligaments are thickenings of the pia mater, which suspend the spinal cord in the dura mater sheath. So these are little thickenings of the pia mater that are going to hold the spinal cord to the dura mater sheath. Denticulate ligaments, so very delicate little ligaments that are part of the pia mater that are holding on to the dura mater sheath. epidural space. So remember, if it's epi, it means on top. This is a space above the dura mater that contains blood vessels, adipose tissue, and loose connective tissue. Here's the epidural space. Here's the dura mater. Here's the arachnoid mater. Here's the subarachnoid space. So the subarachnoid space contains cerebrospinal fluid, which cushions the spinal cord, delivers nutrients, and removes waste. A lumbar puncturing or a spinal tap is a sampling of the cerebrospinal fluid from the subarachnoid space to look for bacteria, blood, white blood cells, or other abnormalities. They use this to diagnose meningitis and other, I'm guessing other issues too. Agents such as blood, chemotherapeutic agents, and analgesics, or contrast media for radiographic purposes can be injected into the subarachnoid space. When someone gets a spinal tap, they insert a needle between, I think it's L3 and L4. Or right underneath L4, somewhere right in that area. And they remove a small amount of cerebrospinal fluid. They have that person lay kind of in a fetal position. Why? But then they tell them to stay like that for a while. I think it can be several hours. Why do they do that? The cerebrospinal fluid it's being secreted from the blood. It's produced from the blood, and it'll circulate, and then eventually it will return to the blood and more will be secreted. It's in a very tight space, and the brain and the spinal cord are spinal cord are suspended in it. If you remove a little bit of fluid from it, there's a pressure drop. You're removing a small amount of volume from a very small amount of fluid. You have to rebuild up that cerebrospinal fluid before it's not going to severely hurt or injure you. I think if people get up and move right afterwards, they probably are not going to be permanently injured, but they're going to feel terrible. Because your brain and your spinal cord are essentially floating in this cerebrospinal fluid. It's a buoyancy thing. And when you remove a volume, you remove pressure that needs to be regenerated before you get up and move around again. I think I had a student a year ago who had, who they thought they found that she was leaking cerebrospinal fluid, constantly dealing with massive headaches and nausea and all sorts of other fun adventures, until they realized where the tears were coming from.
How do they fix that?
I don't know. I don't know what they did. I'd never heard of it until she said something.
It'd be kind of scary.
Yeah. An epidural injection. I'm sure some of you, I know some of you have had children. An epidural injection is where you inject into the epidural space. Remember, this is a space that's just, it's right superficial to the dura mater. Well, anesthetics can be introduced to this space to block pain signals during childbirth or surgery. Steroid injections in the back are done in this space. Questions? Looking at a cross section through the spinal cord, the central area of gray matter is shaped like a butterfly, and it's surrounded by white matter that's organized into 3 funiculi. Here's the gray matter. If you look here, it's the darker matter. It's in the internal area. So the central area of gray matter is shaped like a butterfly, surrounded by white matter that is arranged into 3 funiculi. Another word for funiculi that I think you find it in your lab manual is white columns. We call them, your textbook calls them funiculi, so we're going to refer to them as funiculi. These white columns. The gray matter here in the inner area, the gray matter, like gray matter before, when we were looking at the nervous system, the gray matter is the neuron cell bodies, where there's very little myelin here. So this is a site of information processing and synaptic integration. The white matter is abundantly myelinated axons, carrying signals from one part of the central nervous system to another. So bundles of axons or tracks within the funiculi are going to carry signals from one level of the central nervous system to another. You guys, let's take 10 minutes. Let's come back to this at 9:50.
All right, thanks.
No, I was explaining to the young lady I spoke with, to schedule appointment that, I'm in class, so I have class all the way to 3 o'clock today, so I won't be able to get them there until this afternoon. Yeah, I mean, she transferred me to you. I don't know if that's protocol or.
Yeah, what is it that you want us to do? I mean, do you want to talk to somebody?
No,
Like, what are the,
no, I can wait till his appointment, but I'm saying she transferred me to y'all. I didn't know if that's something that you guys do now. Cause I was wondering why I was waiting to speak with her.
oh, okay. Yeah, we have all that stuff in, you know, the cold congestion week, sometimes it's hard for him to breathe really for us to do until you get here.
Yeah, I wasn't asking anything else. I just wanted to schedule an appointment. Yeah, she transferred me. No, no, ma'am, no. She transferred me to you and I didn't know why I was being, transferred to you. No, we're fine.
Oh, okay, all right, so, I thought maybe there was another question.
No, no, ma'am.
Another concern.
Oh, no. We're fine. Hopefully we'll be okay until, this afternoon.
Okay, sweetie, sounds good. So we'll see you this afternoon at 4:20, okay?
Will do. Thank you.
All right, you're very welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, so let's come back here. So gray matter. So white matter and gray matter. Gray matter is neuronal cell bodies with little myelination. White matter is abundantly myelinated axons organized into tracks. Gray matter has a central core. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Spinal cord has a central core of gray matter. The gray matter is organized into posterior dorsal horns that carry the dorsal root of the spinal nerves of sensory fibers and the cell bodies of interneurons. This is important to remember. It's going to come up again later. But the posterior horns, the dorsal horns, carry the posterior root of the spinal nerves that are coming from the sensory fibers and are synapsing on the cell bodies of the interneurons. The thicker anterior horns carry the anterior root of the spinal nerves related to carry motor fibers. So sensory and posterior fibers coming in through the back. motor anterior fibers coming out the anterior horn. The gray commissure has a central, it connects to the right and left sides of the gray matter and has a central canal that's lined with ependymal cells. What were ependymal cells? Through one of the neuroglia of the central nervous system that secrete cerebrospinal fluid. So the central canal in the gray commissure is going to secrete cerebrospinal fluid and be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. The lateral horn is only observed from T2 to L1 along the spinal cord. And it contains the cell bodies of motor neurons of the sympathetic or visceral nervous system. Remember, the visceral also means the autonomic nervous system. So contains cell bodies of the motor neurons that belong to the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. So posterior horns are bringing in the sensory information, sensory neurons. Anterior horns are where the motor neurons are exiting out. The lateral horn has the cell bodies of the motor neurons involved in the sympathetic autonomic nervous system, your fight or flight response. The white matter of the spinal cord surrounds the gray matter. It is in bundles. So these are the funiculi, these bundles of tracts. So they go up and down the spinal cord, allowing for communication at different levels. The bundles are arranged in 3 pairs of funiculi or columns. There's the posterior or dorsal funiculi, the lateral funiculi, and the anterior funiculi on each side. The subdivisions of each funiculi are called fasciculi or tracts. We'll see fasciculi again later, but these are subdivisions of each of these columns or funiculus. Remember, we talked about how tracts of axons in the central nervous system are called tracts. So our bundles of axons in the central nervous system are called tracts. In the peripheral nervous system, they're called nerves. So all of the fibers within a given bundle or tract in the central nervous system have a similar origin and destination and function. The ascending tracts in the white matter of the funiculi are going to conduct sensory nerve impulses up the spinal cord toward the brain. The descending tracts are going to conduct motor nerve impulses down the spinal cord from the brain. So within these funiculi in the white matter, we have ascending tracts and descending tracts. The ascending tracts are going to conduct sensory information. Descending tracts are going to conduct motor information. So the sensory and the motor tracts in the spinal cord are continuous with the sensory and motor tracts in the brain. each tract carries specific types of information from one location to another. Therefore, if you want to carry painful information from the spinal cord to the brain, you use one particular tract, the spinal thalamic tract. Well, if you want to carry voluntary movement commands from the brain to the spinal cord, you use a lateral corticospinal tract. So sensory information, pain information is a spinal thalamic tract. Voluntary motor information is a descending tract that's going to be the corticospinal tract. Your book lists a lot, it has a lot more tracks than these. Know the ones that are described here. The ones that are described in this PowerPoint, understand those.
Can you go back a sec,
Yep,
please? Thank you.
we're going to go over more.
Oh, okay,
We're going to go over more, Casey.
thank you.
Going to go into a lot more detail with them here. So some tracts undergo decussation, meaning they cross. They cross the midline so that the brain senses and controls the contralateral side of the body. Some tracts don't decussate. So decussation means to cross the midline. Some tracts do not decussate, so those tracts are ipsilateral, meaning the origin and the destination of that tract is on the same side of the body. Contralateral, meaning the origin and destination are on opposite sides of the body. Ascending tracts carry sensory signals up the spinal cord. As the signals are moving up the spinal cord, they travel across 3 different types of neurons from the origin to the destination in the brain. The first order neurons are going to detect the stimulus and transmit the signal to the spinal cord or brainstem. The second order neurons are going to continue from the thalamus, which is in the brainstem, the upper, most superior part of the brainstem. To the upper end of the brainstem. See, I'm sorry, I said that all wrong. The second order neurons are going to carry information from the brainstem to the thalamus, which is in the upper end of the brainstem. The third order neurons are going to carry the signals to the rest of the way from the thalamus to the sensory region of the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is this most outer layer. One thing, because this is the first time that we've actually seen a sagittal section through the brain, how is the white and the gray matter assembled here. Remember that the gray matter is the darker matter, the white matter is the whiter matter. How is it arranged here? The gray matter is on the outside and the white matter is on the inside. How is this different from the spinal cord?
The opposite.
It's the opposite. Exactly. So what that means is all the cell bodies of the cerebral cortex are on the surface. It's going to be important later. But so sensory tracts run through 3 different orders of neurons. The first order neurons transmit the signal to the spinal cord or the brainstem. The second order neurons are going to transmit the signal from the brainstem to the thalamus. The third order neurons are going to transmit that signal from the thalamus to the sensory region of the cerebral cortex. In the posterior funiculus, remember this is one of the white matter columns of the spinal cord. There's 2 different fasciculi. So these are smaller tracts. The gracial fasciculus is going to convey sensory information for discriminative touch. What type of feeling is it? Is it a rough feeling? Is it a slimy feeling? Light pressure and conscious proprioception from the sacral and lumbar body areas to your brain. So from the legs and the lower abdomen to your brain. It's made of first order nerve fibers that are traveling up the spinal cord. So from the lumbar and sacral region, discriminative touch, light pressure, and conscious proprioception. We'll talk about what proprioception is in one moment here. The caniculate fasciculus is going to convey sensory information for discriminative touch, light pressure, conscious proprioception from the thoracic and cervical body areas to your brain, including your arms and your chest and your neck. This is made from first order neurons that are going to carry the same type of signal as the gracial fasciculus. So one is doing the upper part of the body, one is doing the lower part of the body. And both of them are doing discriminative touch, light pressure, and conscious proprioception. And these are both found in the posterior funiculus, so the back white column, posterior white column. So light touch, pressure, proprioceptive senses are carried through these pathways. And what in the world is proprioception? This is a non-visual sense of the position and movements of the body. Mom? Mom? Yep. Will you be my teaching assistant? The dog won't work so well for this one.
Are we doing reflexes?
We're doing proprioception.
Oh.
Start. You didn't know that you were going to be on camera.
No, I did not. I might have.
I
I
didn't
might
warn
have
her.
prepared myself to be seen.
She's coming in her bathrobe because I didn't warn her.
Trust me, I've been up since 6.
Okay, Mother, come here. We gotta do this fast.
Are we doing the reflexes?
No,
No,
we're doing
okay.
proprioception.
Okay, get away from the couch. Then. Are you doing it with
I'm
me?
doing it with you.
Okay,
You want to do it with me?
no, go
You know
ahead.
what to do?
You do it.
Okay. So here she is. Mom, close your eyes. We're not gonna do anything really funny. Just close your, okay. So I'm gonna move your joints. You're just gonna relax, but wherever I put them, you're gonna keep them there.
Okay.
So we're gonna put this up here. And then move these fingers. This finger out like this. This one out. Sorry, are you?
It's
am I
okay.
hurting you?
No, we're good.
Then do like this. Actually, let's do this.
Slowly.
Okay. So, Mom, where is your left arm? Is your left elbow, is it flexed or is it extended?
My left elbow is flexed.
And are your fingers, are they straight or are they curled in?
They're curled in.
And is your thumb, is it tucked in or is it tucked out?
It's extended.
It's extended. Your right arm, is the elbow flexed?
No.
Is it extended?
Yes,
How do you know?
I can feel it.
Are your fingers, are they flexed or extended on the right side?
They're flexed.
How do you know?
They feel flexed.
Okay, thank you, Mom. You guys, how did she know? She had her eyes closed. My mom doesn't lie to me even when it hurts. Her eyes were closed. How did she know?
Proprioception.
See, look at how smart you are. Proprioception. So being able to sense where your joints are in space without seeing it. That's proprioception. So having a non-visual sense of your position and movements of the body without being able to see it. So we've talked about the caniculi and the gracilis fasciculates. The anterior and the lateral funiculi contain the spinal thalamic tract, which is made of second order neurons. Which is going to transmit the sensation of pain, warmth, cooling, tickling, itching, and deep pressure. Remember, these are second order. Due to the crossing of these, or the decussation of these second order neurons, the signals are going to be sent to the contralateral side of the cerebral hemisphere from the site of stimulus. So posterior funiculi are the gracilis fasciculus and cunate fasciculus. Anterior and lateral funiculi are the spinal thalamic tract. In contrast, the descending tracts are going to conduct motor signals down the brainstem and the spinal cord. The upper motor neurons are going to originate in the cerebral cortex and brainstem and terminate on a lower motor neuron. The lower motor neurons are going to be in the brainstem or the spinal cord. So if you remember, the ascending tracts are three different orders: first order, third order, and first order, second order, and third order. Here we're dealing with upper motor and lower motor neurons. So the upper motor is going to originate in the cerebral cortex and terminate on a lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron is in the brainstem or the spinal cord, and it's going to lead out to the muscles or other target organs. In this descending tract, the lateral corticospinal tract is going to conduct nerve impulses from the cerebral cortex of the brain to the spinal cord for voluntary movement of muscles. If your brain decides that it wants your legs to move, it sends this voluntary information command from the brain down the region of the spinal cord to the leg using this tract. Which of the following statements is true concerning the spinal thalamic tract? One thing that you see here, it's made of second order nerve fibers. So it's originating in the spinal cord and it's going up to the thalamus. Is it composed of, is it motor information or is it sensory?
Sensory.
It's sensory, so it can't be D.
Right.
right? Is it white matter? If it's a tract, is it white matter or gray matter? If it's a tract, what is a tract? Tract would be a bundle of axons. These are myelinated axons. So it's not gray matter, it's white matter. We know it doesn't terminate in the spinal cord. It doesn't begin in the thalamus, it ends in the thalamus. So it has to be the last one, that it's composed of multiple axons carrying information in the spinal cord. Probably one of my biggest role, what's the word for it? Heroes was this person. Are you familiar with this person?
Mm-mm.
You're
Yeah.
probably,
Yes.
who is it?
Stephen Hawking.
Stephen Hawking. So he was diagnosed with ALS at about the age of 22, somewhere right in that age group, 22 somewhere. And was told that he had about usually people with ALS die within 2 years. And he just died about a year and a half ago, maybe. And he was the one who actually put together the Big Bang Theory and conceptualized how it would work. ALS is characterized by the progressive degeneration of motor neurons in the spinal cord, brainstem, and motor cerebral cortex. What they know so far is that the neurotransmitter glutamate increases into toxic levels, resulting in and it's an excitatory response. So what it results in is an excitatory toxicity that results in a major rise in intracellular calcium levels. With ultimate destruction of dendrites. If you think back about what you know about the neuron, you can understand that. The destruction of the neurons, destruction of the dendrites would result in destruction of neurons, because that's how they get sensory input. Since his diagnosis, they've learned that there's 2 different types of ALS. It's another name for ALS is Lou Gehrig's disease. There's early onset, which is what he had. And there's later older age onset. So moving forward, talked about the spinal nerve, talked about the spinal cord. Sensory information comes in through the posterior horn. Motor information moves out through the anterior horn. The corticospinal tract is going to be involved in motor conduction. The spinal thalamic tract is going to be involved in sensory information. in the anterior and lateral funiculi. In the posterior funiculi, we have that gracilis fasciculus and cunate fasciculus that are going to be involved in sensory information back there. So now let's talk about the spinal nerves. So the spinal cord communicates with the rest of the body by way of spinal nerves. These are cord-like organs that are composed of numerous nerve fibers bound together by connective tissue, epineurium and perineurium. All of your spinal nerves, once they extend out beyond this convergence point where the anterior motors coming from the anterior, sensories entering through the posterior, they diverge close to the spinal cord, where sensory is going to come in through the dorsal end, the dorsal end. Motor is going to come in through the ventral end or come out the ventral end. However, as the spinal nerve extends from the intervertebral foramen, it's a mixed nerve, meaning that the nerve fiber itself is going to contain both sensory and motor fibers. Remember, another word for sensory is afferent fibers. Another word for motor fibers is efferent. Afferent meaning incoming, efferent meaning exiting. Within the bundle of, actually, before I keep going, let's move forward from there. The endoneurium is the myelin around each individual axon. It's the outer, it's not the myelin, it's the outer coating of the myelin around each axon. Remember that we have myelinated nerve fibers and we have unmyelinated nerve fibers. The axons are bundled together within a perineurium sheath. Paisley, stop. So the perineurium are layers of overlapping squamous cells that wrap around the fasciculus. The epineurium is a dense, irregular connective tissue that's going to wrap the entire nerve. So endoneurium is loose connective tissue that surrounds the neural lemma around each individual myelinated axon. And remember that the unmyelinated axons can be in the folds of the neural lemma. The perineurium is overlapping squamous tissue wrappings, squamous cell wrappings that are going to surround bundles of nerve fibers, meaning the nerve axons. The epineurium is going to be a connective tissue wrapping, irregular connective tissue wrapping around a bundle of fasciculus, of fasciculites. So 3 different wrappings: endoneurium around the neurolemma of individual axons. Perineurium surrounds the bundles of axons that are in fasciculi. The epineurium is going to surround bundles of fasciculi, which remember that a bundle of fasciculi is a bundle of axons. That's the general arrangement. Epineurium on the outside, perineurium, and endoneurium. Nerve fibers of the peripheral nervous system are going to be, remember, they're surrounded by Schwann cells, and the neural lemma is the most outer layer of the Schwann cell myelin. Blood vessels are going to penetrate the connective tissue coverings to provide a blood supply for the metabolic activities of the axon. In one of my master's studies, I spent a lot of time studying, not a lot of time, but a little bit of time studying peripheral neuropathy. One of the major factors involved with peripheral neuropathy is the breakdown of the myelin. And the breakdown of the myelin occurs because of the loss of blood vessels in the myelin, which we call the basal neuron. If you can regenerate the blood vessels within the basal neuron, you can reverse peripheral neuropathy. That was observed in rats. And rats are kind of odd ducks when it comes to how they respond. So how well it would work in a human, I don't know. But that was a study that was observed in rats. So we have different types of nerves. We have sensory afferent nerves, which carry signals from the sensory receptors into the central nervous system. We have motor efferent nerves that carry signals from the central nervous system to muscles and glands. And we have mixed nerves that are bundles of both sensory and afferent fibers. So each one of these here is a bundle of sensory and afferent nerves. We look up here, here's the sensory fibers. We're entering into the posterior horn. So, yeah, sensory fibers moving into the posterior horn. Motor fibers exiting through via the anterior horn. They merge together to form a mixed nerve. I'm guessing, and I would have to look, but each one of these fasciculi, per fasciculi, one is motor, one is sensory. But I am not sure about that. I think, but that sounds about right to me. So both sensory and motor fibers can be described as being somatic or visceral. Somatic, remember, that means skin, joints, muscle, and bone. Visceral is internal organs. General meaning holistic, and special is meaning special senses or specific. So afferent fibers carry sensory signals from the receptors to the central nervous system. Efferent fibers are going to carry motor signals from the central nervous system to the effectors. Somatic are going to innervate the skin, skeletal muscles, bones, and joints. Visceral fibers are going to innervate blood vessels, glands, and viscera. Remember, viscera means organs. General fibers are going to innervate organs such as muscles, skins, glands, viscera, and blood vessels. Special fibers are going to innervate localized organs in the head, eyes, ears, olfactory, your nose, taste receptors, muscles of chewing, swallowing, and facial expression. A ganglion. Remember what a ganglion is. We saw it in the first chapter, in chapter 12. A ganglion is a cluster of neurosomas outside of the central nervous system. Remember, a neurosoma is a cell body. So this is a cluster of cell bodies. The really popular one and the most famous one that we talk about is the posterior root ganglion, also called the dorsal root ganglion. So this is a cluster of the cell bodies for the sensory neurons. Because remember, the posterior root is going to carry the sensory fibers. So among the neurosomas contained within the dorsal root ganglion are bundles of nerve fibers that are going to lead in and out of the ganglion. The dorsal root or the posterior root is a sensory input to the spinal cord. The dorsal root ganglion contains the somas of sensory neurons carrying signals to the spinal cord, with 6 to 8 rootlets carrying this, entering the posterior horn of the cord. The anterior or ventral root is the motor output of the spinal cord, where 6 to 8 rootlets are going to leave the spinal cord and converge to form the anterior root. So posterior root is sensory, anterior root is motor. Questions? Posterior ramus is a branch of each spinal nerve branch of each spinal nerve that innervates certain parts of the skin, muscles of the neck, and deep muscles of the back. Posterior ramus. So here's the spinal nerve coming out. Here's the posterior ramus. Here's the anterior ramus. The anterior ramus in the thoracic region is going to give rise to the intercostal nerves. Remember, what does it mean for intercostal nerves? You have intercostal muscles. Costile meaning ribs. So the intercostal muscles are the muscles that are involved with contraction and relaxation of the ribs. So the anterior ramus is going to innervate the intercostal nerves that innervate the intercostal muscles. The anterior ramus in other regions besides the thoracic region, it will enter into plexuses from which peripheral nerves will arise. So plexuses of motor nerves and sensory nerves that will innervate the ventral and lateral body surfaces. So the anterior ramus is going to enter plexuses. I'm going to pause for 1 second. I'm going to see if I can't find a picture that I found the other night. Excuse me. Let's see here, cross section, anterior. Rami. Posterior. And space. Okay, there it is. Let's see if I can zoom in on this. Maybe if I, or let me try just doing it again. I want to see if I can enlarge this for you. Maybe not. Oh, here. So looking at this, here's a cross section of the spinal cord. We got to orient ourselves here because this is the vertebral body. This is the body of the vertebrae. Body of the vertebrae, where is it? It's on the anterior surface. So this is the anterior side of this cross section. Here's the anterior rami. Here's the posterior rami. It's the white matter, the gray matter. Here's the epidural space. I think a lot of times our diagrams that we get in our books don't do justice for what's really there. But here's your anterior horns. Here's your dorsal horns. Posterior rami, anterior rami. This all this area, this empty space right in here.
All I'm
is-
saying is the
Oh,
anterior ram.
shoot. Shoot.
I was confused. I was
You're
like, wait,
missing it. Here I am trying to show you a cool picture and you're missing it. Do you see it now?
I do much better.
Oh, you're missing it. This is a cool picture. So you got to orient yourselves here. This is the body of the cervical vertebrae. So it's on the anterior side. Looking at a cross section through the spinal cord. Here's the anterior horns. Here's the posterior horns. Here's the anterior rami. Remember, those are the motor nerves. Here's the posterior rami, the sensory nerves. Coming out the posterior horns. Or entering the posterior horns. This little fatty area right here is the epidural space. Here's the dura mater, right underneath it. All this empty space back here is a subarachnoid space. I think a lot of times our diagrams in our books don't do justice. But they are really helpful at the same time. I will add this picture to your to the PowerPoint. I just haven't done it yet. I only found it the other night. And of course, it took me to the very beginning. How did it do that? Really? And I don't want to do this because of my, yep, I knew it was going to do that. Okay, we'll make it through most of the spinal cord, and then we will finish this up. But I thought that's a neat picture, so I had to show it. Rami communicantes. So anterior ramus is going to be the plexuses from which the peripheral nerves are going to arise to innervate the ventral and lateral surfaces. The rami communicantes are branches of each spinal nerve that contain axons related to the autonomic nervous system. Each pair consists of each pair of rami consists of one white ramus and one gray ramus. The rami communicantes. Here's the sympathetic chain ganglion. And coming off each chain is going to be a rami communicante, which has one white rami and one gray rami. Moreover, one branch of each spinal nerve serves the vertebrae, the vertebral ligaments, the blood vessels of the spinal cord, and the meninges. This is the meningeal branch. Well, what's a pinched nerve? A really good example of a pinched nerve is if you take your elbow like this and you slam it really hard against a desk. You know what I'm referring to? Don't do it.
No.
Do me a favor and don't do it. However, one thing that you can do that won't hurt so badly is right here. One second here. Kind of skipping ahead a little bit, but right here, here's your medial epicondyle. Here's your olecraning process. Pinch right there, put pressure right there. And I don't see Becky doing it. She's looking at me and she's not doing it.
Well,
Becky, do
my
it.
one elbow, I had an open fracture, so I have
Okay,
visual.
never mind. You can't do it. All right, someone else do it.
I can try with the other arm.
Do it with the other arm. Put pressure right there. Do you feel it?
Yeah,
What do you feel?
it's almost like a sharp, tingly pain.
Where does it go? Does it go, what side of the arm does it go up?
Goes towards my palm.
Towards your palm? And does it go towards a specific part of your palm?
My pinky.
Yes. It's,
Okay, like that's weird because I'm here, but it's going over there.
yes, it's innervating. Oh, that is kind of weird. It should be on the, I think you are going for the radial one and it's a.
Oh, okay.
What you're doing is you're pinching your ulnar nerve. Mom.
Yeah.
Move Abby before she throws up on the couch. Hey, I got her. Never mind. Sorry. My cat's busy throwing up right behind me on the leather couch. That was not a good idea. So a pinched nerve occurs when there's too much pressure applied to a nerve by the surrounding tissues. So for example, you bang your funny bone nerve. And what you're doing is you're pinching your ulnar nerve up against the bones. You're essentially crushing it up against the bones. So when too much pressure is applied to a nerve by the surrounding tissues, it disrupts the nerve function and causes pain and tingling. A herniated disc in your lower spine can pinch a nerve root, causing pain that radiates down the back of your leg, sciatica. A pinched median nerve in your wrist can lead to pain, numbness, and weakness in your hand and fingers. The dorsal roots along the spinal cord contain what neurons? While the dorsal rami contain what neurons? If you look here, it shows you the blue are sensory, the red are motor. Dorsal root is going to contain sensory. The dorsal rami are going to be mixed.
The dorsal root contains sensory.
Yes, if you look here, here it is right here. It's coming in through the posterior horn. Posterior horn is always going to bring in sensory. So the anterior rami and plexuses, the ventral anterior rami form networks of plexuses. The one place that we don't have a plexus, we have a cervical plexus, we have a brachial plexus, we have a lumbar and a sacral and a coccygeal plexus. We don't have a thoracic plexus. The intercostal or thoracic nerves will not enter plexuses, but will directly innervate the structures they supply in the intercostal spaces. So remember that all of these plexes are being formed by the anterior rami. Cervical plexus is going to serve the skin. It's going to be a formation from the cervical nerve 1 through the cervical nerve 5. And it's going to serve the skin and the muscles of the head, neck, and upper part of the shoulders and diaphragm.
Finn.
One of the major nerves that comes off this cervical plexus is the phrenic nerve. Why do we care so much about the phrenic nerve? Well, it innervates the diaphragm, the major muscle involved in breathing. A break above C1 or C2 is a break in between C1 and C2 or right below C2 is going to result in the loss of the innervation of the phrenic nerve. If you're familiar, some of you might know him, some of you are probably too young. Christopher Reeves, do you remember who that was?
Yep.
What
Yep.
happened to him?
He was an actor that
Blowing
played
out the,
the first Superman, yeah, and he fell off a horse.
He fell off a horse and he received a break between C1 and C2. And it's kind of a big deal because, like Kat said, he was the Superman in the original Superman movies. And that results in loss of the innervation of the diaphragm, resulting in, from that point on, not being able to breathe on your own. So good mnemonic, C3, C4, C5, keep the diaphragm alive. Because the phrenic nerve, if you look, it's right here, it's going to come off C5, it's going to come off C4, and it's going to come off C3.
Can you just
So cervical plexus, major nerve is the phrenic nerve. Injuries to the phrenic nerve can be replaced with sometimes what they call breathing pacemaker system, where the phrenic pacing provides ventilation support for patients with chronic respiratory insufficiency. But the diaphragm and the lungs and the phrenic nerve have to have some residual function. So it's a pacemaker. We talked about heart pacemakers. This and next semester, you'll talk more about that. But this is a pacemaker for innervating the phrenic nerve. Brachial plexus, coming off C5 to T1, is divided into roots. and then trunks, divisions, nerves, and cords. Major nerves coming off is the musculocutaneous nerve, the median nerve, the ulnar nerve, the radial nerve, and the axillary nerve. Remember that ulnar nerve is the one that we pinch to when we pinch our funny bone nerve.
Why do they call it the funny bone? Because it's not funny when you hit it.
For some reason, it's not very funny. I don't get it.
It hurts.
I think because it tingles. It's really not very funny for some reason.
No.
I think it's funny when never mind. All right, never mind. I was gonna say I think it's funny when someone else does it. No,
Oh yeah. Always.
it's not funny. So brachial plexus coming off C5 to T1. Injuries to the median nerve. This is what results in carpal tunnel syndrome. There's a fibrous connective tissue, the carpal retinaculum, that wraps around the tendons and nerves of the your carpal wrist. It gets inflamed and it puts pressure on the median nerve. And that's where the tingling comes from the median nerve. What they do to treat it is they go in and they make tiny cuts in this connective tissue ring and kind of lessen the pressure there and give the median nerve a little bit more space. My dad is a real computer guru kind of person. It skipped me in the genetics, but he's a real computer person and he's had surgery on it 3 times. He keeps giving himself carpal tunnel syndrome. Erb's palsy is paralysis of the arm that often occurs as a baby's head and neck are pulled toward the side at the same time as the shoulders pass through the birth canal. So it's a traumatic injury to the brachial plexus. That injures the median nerve, causes it to hang down. Wrist drop. Nerves are violently stretched. Ulnar nerve, so this is that funny bone nerve. Largest unprotected nerve. Emerges from the brachial plexus and supplies the medial half of the hand. Very end, I'll show you what my little niece decided to this last summer put her finger through a plain glass window. And she cut her ulnar nerve. She may never get full functioning of it back. I've tried to get her to stop this high risk, high adventure lifestyle that she's living. She's not really cooperating.
They never do.
I know the fact is she sprained her ankle like 3 weeks before she did that. And then she sprained her other ankle about 3 weeks ago. I'm trying, but she just doesn't listen to me. The damage results, ulnar nerve damage results in abnormal sensations in the fingers and inability to abduct or adduct the little unringed fingers. Results in a claw hand deformity. lumbar plexus supplies the anterior lateral abdominal wall, the external genitalia, and part of the lower limbs. The femoral nerve is the largest nerve in this plexus. You look, it's coming off L2, L3, and L4. Damage to this nerve. Nerves, whatever they innervate, whatever they move through, whatever muscles they move through, whatever they pass by, they innervate. So if a nerve passes through a muscle, it innervates that muscle. Damage to the femoral nerve results in an inability to extend the leg and loss of sensation in the skin over the anterior medial aspect. Because anywhere that it passes, it's going to innervate. One reason that when you go into future anatomy courses, we spend a lot of time going through the routes of nerves, is because wherever they travel, they innervate that area. It's the lumbar nerve. The sacral plexus is going to supply the buttocks, the peritoneum, and the part of the lower limbs. The major nerve coming off is the sciatic nerve. Damage to the sciatic nerve results in sciatica. Which is pain shooting down the back leg. My mom says it's rarely tingling, it's actually pain.
It is. I had that when I was pregnant. My son was sitting on my sciatic nerve. And it
Well,
was, that was horrendous.
that wasn't very nice of him.
No, I threatened his life numerous times. But yeah, like I couldn't, it would all of a sudden, like I would stand there and then next minute I couldn't, like I would just, my leg would give out. My husband would have to carry me up the stairs. I couldn't, well, it was so horrible.
Ouch. Ouch.
Yeah.
So major nerve coming off. Sciatic nerve. If irritated, this nerve will cause hiccups. What nerve's involved in somewhere up in that area that would cause hiccups?
Phrenic nerve?
It's the phrenic nerve. Yep. So let's talk about dermatomes, and this is where we'll end. First, are there any questions? Dermatomes are specific areas of the skin that convey sensory input to a spinal nerve. The dermatome is a diaphragm of the cutaneous regions that's innervated by each spinal nerve. So each spinal nerve innervates a certain patch of skin. They can overlap by as much as 50%. knowing which of the spinal segments supply which dermatome allows it possible to locate the damaged regions of the spinal cord. One thing that makes dermatomes really obvious is shingles. Someone gets chickenpox at some point in their life. The varicella zoster virus, which causes which causes chickenpox, remains dormant in the dorsal root ganglia. In most people, or some people, it stays dormant forever and is kept in check by the immune system. However, if the immune system is compromised, it can travel along the sensory nerve fibers via that fast axonal transport and cause shingles. The virus is going to characterize a painful trail of skin discoloration and fluid-filled nerves along the dermatomes. You guys have any questions for me at all?
Mm-mm.
Okay. This, I think, is a really good spot to end. We'll end right here. So we'll pick this up next week. We'll finish it. Don't remember what slide number we're on, but we're close to finishing. We're going to go over reflexes. And then we will start on chapter 14.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
You
Have a
too.
good weekend.
Bye. Have a good
Thanks.
weekend. Bye.
Have a good one, guys.
Bye. Be careful.
You too.
If you're still there, Mary, I just added my name because this is my new iPad, so it didn't have my name when I started this
You're
morning.
fine. You're fine.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna send you an email soon. I work tonight and like the next 5 days. It's
That's
crazy,
fine.
but all
That's
right,
fine.
Mary, I'll catch up with you, okay?
You're well. Yes, of course, Wendy.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good night. Have a good weekend.
I'll try. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Ariana, Mila, or Jada, are you there?